When tillage begins, other arts follow. The farmers, therefore, are the founders of human civilization. This is the story of Robert Brace, a third-generation farmer engaged in a 7-year wetlands battle with government agencies. His belief that the United States Constitution guarantees all Americans the right to own and use their own land was the principal foundation for engaging in such a long and difficult fight against an overwhelming bureaucracy. In the words of Bob's attorney, very few of us, I'm afraid, would be willing to make such a stand. This entire episode graphically demonstrates the need to change the course of land use regulation in Pennsylvania as well as the country. Robert Brace was the youngest of 3 children born to Charles and Mary Brace on May 3rd, 1939. The son of a dairy farmer, Bob grew up knowing long days of hard work. Working from dawn to dusk 7 days a week was not unusual, especially in the summer months when grains were harvested for feed, as shown here in this 1943 photo. At the age of 15, Bob engaged in an FHA project at school, growing approximately 90 acres of cabbage, which he sold to markets in the tri-state region. This was the beginning of a 40-year career in agriculture. In late 1975, Bob's father, Charles, retired from his beef and dairy business. Not wanting to see the family farm sold to outsiders, Bob decided to purchase his 137-acre homestead farm for its appraised price of $170,000. At a time when interest rates were soaring, it was a difficult decision to make. But Bob felt that much of the pasture land that had been used for his father's dairy and beef operation could be utilized and improved to make excellent land for growing row crops and roadside vegetables. In the spring of 1977, Bob removed the old fence posts and began a conservation project of clearing brush and cleaning and repairing an existing drainage system on the farm. The State Game Commission had introduced beaver into northwestern Pennsylvania sometime during the early 1940s. And during the 30 years that followed, the beaver had multiplied dramatically, creating dams in the drainage areas, causing ditches to fill in and water to back up onto otherwise dry property. With the permission of the State Game Commission, the dams were removed and the beaver live-trapped by commission officials and transferred to other areas. Other state agencies, including the Pennsylvania Fish Commission and Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources, were also aware of Bob's conservation efforts and acknowledged that his activities were covered under agricultural exemptions outlined under applicable state laws not requiring a permit. Bob also worked with the United States Department of Agriculture and Soil Conservation Service in his plans to restore the existing drainage system. This was the type of project encouraged by USDA in order to promote soil and water conservation. In the 10 years that followed, Bob restored most of the property that had been adversely affected by the beaver. Much of the work was done as time and personal funds became available, but was always a continuing effort on an annual basis. Bob always made a point of establishing buffer areas around farm fields as part of his overall conservation efforts. By 1986, the farm was in nearly excellent condition, with just a few minor improvements yet to be made. In the spring of 1986, a family of beaver migrated onto the property, and Bob again requested their removal by the Pennsylvania Game Commission. 1 year later, after several requests, 2 representatives from the commission appeared on the property to relocate the beaver. However, a senior official by the name of Andrew Martin scanned the farm and stated to Bob that he believed the property would, in his words, make a nice sanctuary, and asked Bob where his permits were for cleaning his ditches. Bob explained to the official that he didn't believe he was in need of any permits because this type of work was covered under agricultural exemptions. He also stated that the game officer accompanying him had removed beaver 10 years earlier and that he and several other government agencies were well aware of the work that had been performed. In fact, this same officer provided Bob with his sworn affidavit verifying this very fact and acknowledged that he was well aware of Bob's efforts to make his farm productive. He also stated that he had notified the Pennsylvania Fish Commission prior to removing the beaver. The senior game officer, however, was indifferent to these facts, which led to an exchange of words and a statement to Bob that he didn't know what trouble could be. Several days later, representatives from 7 different agencies, federal, state, and local, appeared without notice and without permission on Bob's property, excavating soil and plant species. 2 months later, in July of 1987, Bob received notice from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps of Engineers, and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources, claiming he had filled wetlands by cleaning his ditches and removing brush. He was ordered to restore the property to its former condition or face criminal and civil penalties and possible imprisonment. Outraged and in disbelief of the actions being taken against him, Bob consulted with legal counsel. Together they met several times with government representatives in an attempt to resolve the situation. Many documents were produced indicating that Bob's work fell under the agricultural exemption outlined under the Section 404 program of the Federal Clean Water Act and other applicable state and federal statutes. Documents were provided showing the assistance and approval of the USDA and Soil Conservation Service in Bob's efforts, including a wetland commencement determination from USDA indicating Bob's activities had commenced prior to December 23, 1985, and, according to Federal Register, were allowed to continue if completed by January 1, 1995. Additional documents were provided showing that in 1984, after portions of Erie County experienced flooding from heavy rains, USDA paid Bob to clean the very ditches that EPA now contends should be filled back in along with cementing the tile lines in order to reflood the property. And although it is implicit in Section 404 that there be an opportunity for individuals to at least apply for a permit or assert a claim of exemption, no such opportunity was ever provided to Bob, and the government refused to process a permit application. To overzealous bureaucrats who were out to make an example that what they believed to be wetlands should be preserved at any price, none of these factors were important. That left Bob with only 2 alternatives: restore the property to its former unproductive state, spending thousands of dollars to do so, and losing the tens of thousands he had invested in the last 10 years, or fight the powerful system of government lawyers and bureaucrats with unlimited tax dollars who could mount a long and expensive legal case against him. In the nearly 7 years that followed, Bob was subjected to harassment and vilification by government officials, environmental organizations, and self-proclaimed preservationists who declared him to be one of the country's worst polluters and a flagrant violator of wetland laws, despite the fact that the government had never produced any evidence of environmental harm or pollution and ignored the fact that other federal and state agencies had encouraged and assisted him in his endeavor. All this took place despite the fact that the system hadn't allowed Bob any avenue of recourse to present his defenses to a judge or jury to determine his guilt or innocence. In fact, in cases like Bob's, and unknown to many individuals, citizens must wait for the government to file suit in order to challenge the government's order in court. Citizens like Bob cannot force the government to sue. Rather, citizens must wait until the regulators file suit against them. This is often after spending years of being dragged through a regulatory and administrative maze with the hopes that the individual will give in to their demands. As stated in 1993 by former Congressman Tom Ridge, now governor of Pennsylvania, in a very real sense, Bob was forced to prove his innocence, something that tells me this system is messed up. Something is terribly wrong when a private citizen has to endure a 7-year legal battle and spend thousands of dollars to prove that his property is his own and establish that he didn't do anything to violate a regulation. Current laws also make it very easy for preservationists to file lawsuits on their own. And in December of 1989, a group known as the Pennsylvania Environmental Defense Foundation sent Bob a letter threatening him with a lawsuit of their own if he didn't follow government orders and restore his property within 30 days. After nearly 7 years, Bob's perseverance and burning desire to prove his innocence paid off in late November of 1993. After a 4-day non-jury trial, U.S. District Court Judge Glenn Menser found Bob innocent of all charges. In his opinion, Judge Menser wrote, "This certainly does not appear to be the type of case where a corporation or large farming enterprise takes control of a parcel of land and dramatically alters the composition of the land and runs roughshod over the requirements of the Clean Water Act." He went on to state, "This court finds that the defendant's activities on the site constituted an integral part of long-range upland soil and water conservation practices. The farming activities on the site were designed to enhance productivity in the upland area by allowing water to flow to its natural courses with a consequential improvement to the soil. Such course of action, together with regularly cleaning of the drainage system on the site, constituted maintenance of the drainage system and, as such, is exempt from the permit requirements of the Clean Water Act." Upon personally viewing the property, Judge Menser also found that not more than 25% of the property in question even met the definition of a wetland. Judge Menser's decision verified exactly what Bob had indicated to officials nearly 7 years earlier. The U.S. Department of Justice filed its notice of appeal at the last minute on February 14, 1994, the final day allowed. The U.S. Court of Appeals will be the last judicial step in this lawsuit prior to any appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Hi, I'm Bob Brace, and the purpose of this film has been to let everyone see for themselves the environmental destruction the government has insisted we created on our property. I would like to educate as many people as possible about the heavy hand of government. Take it from someone who has experienced it firsthand. Issues such as wetlands, scenic rivers, natural areas, endangered species, and on are real. And you must take a stand for your land. Because without property rights and the right to own and use property, everyone will lose. We all want clean air and clean water, but how clean is clean? We now measure in parts per trillion and quadrillion. Even nature isn't that clean. Without a healthy economy and the right to own and use property, we as a nation are sure to fail, just as all other countries in the world with excessive government controls and police powers have failed. Excessive government controls take away a person's incentives and dreams. And without these, a person will surely stagnate and become unproductive, eventually becoming dependent upon government programs. I have witnessed 3 major USDA programs fail in the last 40 years. Soil Bank came first, then the Corn Bank, and then CRP. And this is not to mention a host of farm subsidies, all costing the American taxpayers billions of dollars, leaving farmers less productive and more dependent on government, which I personally believe has caused most of our farm foreclosures. If we are to be successful with our nation's farms, it must come with free markets and a capitalistic government that allows the right to own and use property. We all know private property is generally better cared for than property owned by the government. And we also know that people won't work for nothing. If we continue to regulate land use to the point of no use, farmers and landowners are sure to lose their incentives and dreams, therefore destroying our way of life in America. Again, I can tell you firsthand what excessive government and police powers have done to my own way of thinking. Remember, government is not our answer. Private enterprise and living by the Constitution is our answer. With that in mind, I would like to urge people to make it a point to get involved. Take a stand for your land and private property to assure your family the right to the American dream. Do it now. Don't wait until it's too late.
On November 22, 1994, nearly 1 year after the U.S. District Court vindicated Bob, a 3-judge panel serving for the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia reversed Judge Menser's decision. In their opinion, normal farming practices used by Bob and hundreds of other farmers throughout Pennsylvania and the nation do not qualify under the guidelines promulgated by regulatory bureaucrats. In reaching this seemingly counterintuitive decision, the panel completely sidestepped a statute enacted by Congress which specifically states that permits are not needed for agricultural activities related to normal farming practices, including the maintenance of drainage ditches. On December 20th, 1994, Bob petitioned the Third Circuit for rehearing, but was denied less than 1 month later. This development puts Bob in a completely untenable position. The Third Circuit sent the case back to the District Court for enforcement of the EPA's restoration order and for determination of a civil penalty. Now that the original order has been upheld, Bob is theoretically liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions in penalties. Moreover, to EPA, restoration of the property means converting it into a wetlands preserve. To Bob, it means destroying the farm he's worked so long and hard to make productive. What is striking about this is the government's ability to put Bob in a regulatory catch-22. His only alleged violation was that he didn't have a Corps of Engineers permit to clean sediment from his farm drainage ditches and redeposit the sediment back on the farm fields from which it washed in the first place. Instead of simply directing Bob to stop while he applied for a permit, our government tried to coerce Bob into complying with the restoration order, thus destroying his farm under threat of enormous fines, penalties, and even jail. To make sure citizens like Bob can't escape its clutches, the government goes on to adopt a policy that it won't process permit applications when the applicant is in violation. Thus, Bob could never claim his farm exemption or try to get a permit once the bureaucrats said he was in violation. And don't forget, years after the government started this process, Judge Menser, the highly respected federal judge who heard the testimony and actually saw the farm, decided that Bob's farming activity was exempt and did not need a federal permit. Why wasn't that enough for the government? The answer is that the government apparently will stop at nothing to grind down citizens who, in seeking to exercise their constitutional rights, do not surrender to bureaucratic dictates. Citizens deserve better. After nearly 8 years of bureaucratic abuse and regulatory finagling, now rubber-stamped by the Court of Appeals, Bob now faces his last hope to obtain justice. He plans to ask the U.S. Supreme Court to hear his appeal of the Third Circuit's decision and hopefully restore his faith in the system and the confidence of the farmers of this nation that they may maintain their agricultural drainage systems, a vital and necessary aspect in the producing of food and fiber for the citizens of this country. As Congress clearly intended, without the fear of fines, imprisonment, and harassment, and appellate court deference to unelected bureaucrats to the detriment of the ordinary citizen.
On June 26, 1995, the Supreme Court of the United States denied Bob's petition for a hearing, thus forcing him to comply with the appellate court's ruling. Late fall of 1996, Bob complied with the government orders to destroy his agricultural drainage system by removing tile lines placed there nearly 2 decades before and filling in drainage ditches. He also paid a final penalty of $10,000 and by order of the government signed a recordable document stating that the property would remain in a wetland state for perpetuity. With 12 years of his life now consumed by the system, thousands of dollars spent, and his property lost to any future economic use, Bob was presented for the first time the right to sue the U.S. government. In November of 1998, Bob filed a Tucker Act claim of $3.25 million, plus interest and attorney's fees, as compensation for the regulatory taking of his land. At an awards ceremony in Washington, D.C., Bob was both pleased and proud to accept the Lincoln Heritage Institute's 1998 Guardian Award for demonstrating an unwavering commitment to upholding the Fifth Amendment of our U.S. Constitution and fighting for the principles cherished by millions of Americans.
I find that Mr. Brace is one of the bravest, most courageous men that I've ever had the privilege of meeting. And it's my privilege at this time to present to Mr. Brace the award from the Lincoln Heritage Institute, the Private Sector Award. Mr. Bob Brace.
Thank you, Helen. I really appreciate it.
And here's a plaque, too, that we'd like to present to you. You're truly a hero to us, and we appreciate your courage more than we can possibly say.
Well, I'm sure glad that people are starting to listen, and I appreciate everything you said, and I can't say enough. I can't emphasize enough to tell people, what the feeling is when you find that you don't have the right to use your own property. And the Constitution that I've heard mentioned so much in the last month means more than everything else put together, I believe. Because without the Constitution, I've said it and I'll continue to say it, we're going to fail. I know there's, if not hundreds of thousands of people that are in the same boat that haven't had the opportunity to fight this issue, because when they come out there, your due process is exactly eliminated. I mean, you don't have due process in environmental law. It's our land. We shouldn't be given 10 or 15 or 20 acres or whatever to use a portion of your property. Then when it comes to takings, they're going to say, well, we only took 30% or 40%, so therefore it's not a taking. I make the example all the time. It's like me going to the bank, and I asked the teller, I said, how much money do you have in here? She says, $1 million. I said, well, give me $300,000. She gives me the $300,000 at gunpoint, and I go home, and the authorities try to make me arrest. Now, I said, well, I left plenty of money for them to open up in the morning. I didn't take that much. I didn't do anything wrong. That's the way I feel about our property. No different. Our society is actually supporting thievery on property. When I say they, I'm meaning the Game Commission, the Fish Commission, the Fish and Wildlife, the DEP, the EPA.
You're up against 5 federal agencies, and they all have lawyers, and they all have biologists and aquatic people, and amazing resources. And you wouldn't have some, when you just think of all the employment, I think there's something like 210,000 people that work for the Environmental Protection Agency.
Every agency that is out there, they all have different sets of guidelines and different rules and regulations. And you think that you're within the law or the perimeter of the law, and you find out that you're not, because there's been administrative law that maybe the Army Corps of Engineers said this is what the definition of wetland is, and we're going to use that no matter what you say. So, I can have all the proof in the world, and it doesn't mean a thing, because they say that this is what we want, this is what we're going to have, and this is what we're going to get. And that's what makes this so disturbing, that you think that in this country you don't have those situations, you have due process. But under administrative law, you don't have due process. The burden of proof is on you. You're guilty, and you're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent, and you're probably not going to prove yourself innocent because they won't let you.
I think he would tell you probably, and maybe he has told you, that the real sacrifice has been time away from working on the family farm, bringing his boys along, enjoying his daughters and his grandchildren.
It made it very hard. Anywhere you go meet people someplace or whatever. Well, you guys are the ones that are in trouble with the wetlands, and always makes you feel a little bit funny, because people, kind of look down on you because, well, you destroyed the environment, is what they're, thinking. Just always made it very, very hard.
The impact of knowing firsthand that we don't have such a thing as private property in this country is very devastating to myself, my boys, the way we have lived and the way we continue to try to live. You get up every morning and you keep asking yourself, why are we doing this? If society believes that they can take what we've worked a lifetime, that they can take it at a whim because they're going to call it a wetland or a nature area or whatever it may be. And, it's very hard. I've always said and continue to say that if you don't have a dream, you're not going anywhere. And that's basically what it does. It takes your dreams away from you, because that's what especially farming. You got to like to do it, you got to want to do it, and you got to be willing to work 70, 80, 90 hours a week if it takes it. And we do that around here. We don't believe in government subsidies. We do that.
So it makes you wonder what you should do. I just had a little girl, wondering what kind of life she's going to have. If we don't get things changed, what kind of society is she going to live in? You wake up every day and you just wonder, like my dad said, what do you do it for? It's ruined your life. It's ruined everybody's life. You asked the question if we've ever thought about any other jobs. And up until this problem, no. The only thing I want to do is farm.
I think anybody that would ever stop and think the time and the effort and what you're going to produce food for this country, and then to have the agencies come down on you so hard and try to make you look like you're a bad person, they actually ruin your reputation. It took me, I would say, the better part of 8 years before people even start to believe. And I was a person that always believed in the truth, that you would tell the truth, and people, like Randy was saying, you know, something more had to happen. That wasn't all that happened. You know, and you try to explain to them that's the laws, that's the regulations we have today, and it needs change. But, you know, people are on deaf ears until something happens to them. In our society today, we have selective enforcement, and that makes it very hard because, you know, I tell you or someone else or whatever what's really happening, and then my neighbor or your neighbor or somebody else's neighbor does exactly the same thing I'm saying you can't do. And it makes it very difficult to get your message across. It's almost impossible. And that's why we've been determined and try to stay determined to see this to the end. And that's why it's so hard, as I indicated before, when it's going to take 12 or 15 years of your life. You know it's going to take that long before you can make an effort to prove that you were right. But I say this, if I die tonight, it's only a very short time. People are going to know that we were telling the truth.